There is a must-read book that has just come out called Nation of Victims, Identity Politics, The Death of Merit and the Path Back to Excellence. It is out today. Vivek Ramaswamy is the author, and he joins me now. Vivek, first question, and don't hate me for this if I've had it wrong the whole time. I am the worst on names, the worst. And every time I see you on a show, you never correct anybody. And they're always pronouncing your name a different way. Am I getting it wrong and you're just being very polite? Or is Vivek the way you say your name?
That. Vivek is right. Vivek like cake Ramaswamy. Ramaswamy. Yep.
Okay.
You got it.
All
exactly. Right. Yeah, those TV hits you usually get like 3 to 4 minutes. I prefer to talk about content, but since you asked, I love it.
Okay. So Vivek, I just, out of respect for you, because I'm watching it and I'm so paranoid, I always get things wrong on names, always. Even like my wife, I would screw up her name. I just wanted to make sure. Okay, so Nation of Victims is out. And you're known, at least on this program, as somebody who is very into ESG, against it. You are doing everything you can to bring back merit. This book does not really deal with ESG or anything like that. This is the answer in our own lives. Would you agree?
That's right, Glenn. Yeah. I would agree. I mean, look, I think that there's two sides to this equation, right? Even if you think about the kind of stuff we usually talk about in this program, the kind of stuff I'm working on in the private sector, yes, that is about corporate meddling in our culture. It is about the use of corporate power to advance one-sided progressive agendas, but it takes two to tango. What do I mean by that? It also takes a population and a consumer base that's willing to buy those narratives and use that to actually be moved by it. And so what this book is about is the broader cultural question. Why is it that consumers are so hungry for a cause and purpose and meaning and identity that they fall for these victimhood narratives that companies and other cynical actors sell them? That's what this book's about. And the case I make in this book is that we've fallen into a moment in our history where we see hardship as the same thing as victimhood. Well, guess what? My thesis is that hardship is not the same thing as victimhood. Hardship is part of what teaches us who we are, both as individuals and as a people. And I think the black hole at the vacuum of the Americans, and the vacuum at the heart of the American soul right now, is our absence of a shared national identity. And the case I make in this book is that we can fill that vacuum with a shared national identity based on the unapologetic pursuit of excellence through our system of free market capitalism and as individuals who are free agents in the world, regardless of the color of our skin or where our parents came from. That's why I wrote this book.
So where do you think the big turning point, because I think it was 2008 when the bailout happened. We're now doing all of that. And it was the end of personal responsibility for corporations.
It really was. It was the death of personal responsibility at every level of society. So I think 2008 was a big turning point for a lot of reasons. What happened in 2008? We had the 2008 financial crisis. We had the bailouts. We had no accountability for a lot of financial institutions that took risk at the public's fisc. When times were good, they got paid. When times went bad, the public had to bail them out. But that was also the birth of the identity politic wing of the new left. It was Barack Obama elected as the first black president of the United States. A lot of the victimhood narratives that went with that. We're also then in the thick of the greatest intergenerational wealth transfer in human history, from the baby boomer generation to my generation of millennials and Gen Z. And I think that creates a new victimhood culture and a culture of entitlement as well. So there were a lot of things around the turn of the last decade. There were a lot of factors in our culture that conspired to create this new culture of victimhood. And one of the things I describe in the book is also the rise of a laziness culture, even in our workforce, but in our culture more broadly. And one of the things I say in the book is that victimhood fits laziness like a glove, in that people today who are lazy and don't want to work construe that not just as their own sloth, which is one of the human vices, but also as a narrative of the grand fight against the oppression of capitalism, the oppression of modernity, the colonialism of capitalism. I mean, these are the kinds of things you hear as part of the Great Resignation on Reddit in the pandemic. It started back in the post-2008 era. And so I think it was the combination of a new laziness culture of entitlement that came from my generation being on the receiving end of this large intergenerational wealth transfer but combined with these victimhood narratives that justified that laziness with a moral veneer, that's part of what led to us now having a shared national identity based on victimhood. We're a nation of victims.
So
and I think the case I make is we need to graduate from that.
You talk about Plato's ideal society, and you talk about it because you say, that's how we find the ideal citizen. What is the ideal citizen in 2022?
In America, I mean, this is the question of our hour, okay? So I think there are two parts to what it means to be American, and I think each of us has some of this in our heart. On one hand, we all want to be an individual who's able to pursue our own individualistic dreams through the system of free market capitalism. That's what we think of as the American dream. I have that impulse. You have that impulse. Most of the listeners in this program share that feeling too. That's half the story. That's what I call the pursuit of excellence, the unapologetic pursuit of excellence. But I think there's another half of the story too, Glenn. I think that many on the right, many of us have missed for years, which is also our hunger to be part of a nation that is greater than the sum of its parts, a collective whole as citizens. And that's the side of our identity as individuals that really, I think, revolves around also the revival of civic duty. One of the chapters in the book is entitled A Theory of Duty. It's a play on John Rawls's A Theory of Justice, which was the North Star of the left for much of the late 20th century. I offer what I call a theory of duty, which talks about the revival of civic duty. And the case I make is that it's not at odds with liberty to have a civic duty. Our civic duty as citizens is different than the freedoms we want to have in all of the other spheres of our lives, including economically. And I think it's one of the things that conservatives sometimes get wrong. We get wrong in our obsession with just talking about freedom. And believe me, I'm 10 out of a scale of 10 on that discussion. We miss the fact that if we have civic duties as citizens, that actually gives us greater fortitude to pursue our freedoms through the system of free market capitalism, through our pursuit of excellence as individuals. And so that's the philosophy at the heart of this book, actually.
I'm old enough that, in high school, you couldn't graduate without having a class called Rights and Responsibilities. And we've forgotten the responsibility part. And that is, like you say, huge. But, I learned something when I lived in New York City. When I moved to New York City, I was always a guy who, if there was garbage on the street, I would, pick it up and throw it in the garbage can. And it was just ingrained in me. I grew up in a smaller town. And after about 2 years of living in New York, there was garbage at the front of my building on 6th Avenue. And it was just, this newspaper was just blowing everywhere. And my first thought was, how much money do I have to pay this stupid city for them to keep it clean? And I stopped in my own tracks and I thought, oh my gosh, I've turned into one of them.
In a certain sense, well, that's really honest of you, Glenn, to talk about looking in the mirror that way. It's something that more of us ought to do, is actually, before we point the finger outward, let's take a mirror and look within. It's funny, I'm talking to you from a car in New York City right now, where I'm literally seeing bottles lining the street on the left-hand side of my car without somebody stepping down to pick it up.
Yeah.
And I think that idea of civic duty is something that, I could call out the liberal side of this. I have been for years. I do a little bit of that in the book as well. But I think it's a place for the conservative movement to look internally and say, all right, look, we can criticize the poison that fills the vacuum all we want. At the end of the day, we're not rising to the occasion if we don't fill that vacuum with something more meaningful, something more rich that dilutes the poison to irrelevance.
So help me out, because Vivek, I think, and I know religion plays a big part, in the book and in your life. The right would say we do our civic duty. We're much more charitable. We work through our churches. I know people who go on missions all the time. I mean, we do our civic duty. That's what they would say. The left.
Well, I think we need more of that. We need more of that. And so I think there's definitely, that's why I'm more interested in speaking to the conservative movement than I am to the left, because I think that there's a greater chance of filling that national vacuum if we're going to have to pick which political party or which political movement's going to do it. I'm more optimistic about the conservative movement. So that's why I'm, preaching to that choir rather than the other one, because I think that's our best chance of success. I think we need to revive that, though. And I think there's one of two directions for the future of the conservative movement. Either one that wallows in a new version of victimhood in response to left-wing victimhood, which I've been, by the way, a big critic of. And a lot of what I'm saying is a self-reflection, Glenn. I have spent the last 2 years criticizing a lot of woke victimhood culture, left-wing victimhood culture. But one of the things I've learned, talking about introspection for myself, is how much we're moving the needle a little bit by putting the spotlight on the problem. But if we want to move the needle in a big way, I mean, we have about a generation left to save the identity of this country. And if we're going to do it, it's not going to come just by pointing our finger at all of the hypocrisies of the other side, because that would take all of our time.
No.
We would have no time left, and time would have run out before we're actually able to save our national identity. We need to fill the void of national identity with something else. And what I offer in this book is two visions for that. One is the revival of the shared pursuit of excellence. That's part of what I'm working on, by the way, in the private sector. In the letter that I sent to the board of directors of Chevron last week, through what I'm doing at Strive, I'm trying to do that through the private sector. That's still only half the story, though. And I think that as citizens, we also need to revive our sense of civic duty to start talking about that more. I think it's a provocative idea I offered in my last book. I talk about it in this one, too, of even thinking about weaving civic service into education. That's something that makes conservatives, a lot of libertarian-leaning conservatives, even myself 10 years ago, would have recoiled at that idea. That feels like it's an infringement on our liberty. Well, what I say is, first of all, if you start at a young enough age, we accept that children under the age of 18 or 16 are not yet free agents in the world. We have to create those citizens. And weaving the idea of service, of identity as a citizen in your country, is part of what allows you to actually be an unapologetic capitalist, an unapologetic free agent once you do enter that world. And part of the problem, I think, is that we have an entire generation, my generation, that never learned how to do actual service, nor how to pursue their self-interest in their own right by commingling the two. We never learned how to actually do either one on its own. And so I think we'll actually create a greater generation of capitalists, a greater generation of free individualist agents in the world, if we also revive this idea of living out our civic duties. And I think that you're right, a lot of conservatives in their private lives do it. I think we need to make that a part of a North Star what it means to be a conservative in America.
I think you're seeing that now with the takeover of the school boards and, the local city councils, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, conservatives, they were busy keeping their nose, to their business and down to the grindstone and et cetera, and just thought, this is all being taken care of. It was being taken care of, just not in a way we appreciate.
Exactly. And one of the things I like to do, Glenn, is sometimes let's take a step back from the present. Let's take a walk through history. So one of the things I do in the book is actually, I talk to a lot about a post-Civil War history and the Reconstruction era, but one of the areas of history I go to is actually Roman history. And one of the things I reminded myself of is, you hear a lot of analogies today between the fall of the American experiment and the fall of Rome. Well, guess what? There was no one rise or one fall of Rome. There were many rises and many falls. And you know what? I don't think we're done with this American experiment quite yet either. There were many rises and many falls of Rome. There were many rises and many falls of this country and this great experiment as well. And I tell the story of, it was an interesting one. I hadn't studied it since high school. Emperor Septimius Severus. He was known as the Black Emperor. Okay, that's how I studied him in high school, at least. One of the things I learned while doing the research for this book is actually he only got that name, the Black Emperor, in the last few decades as he was redescribed in modern American history. There was a TV series that highlighted the story of the first black man to walk on England's soil came not as a slave, but as a conqueror. And then they made a whole narrative around it. Well, the funny thing is, if you go back to the Roman era, people could see that he had dark skin, but it was no different than someone having dark eyes or dark hair. The thing they actually cared about was, were you a Roman citizen or were you not? Were you a member of this nation or were you not? That's how they actually saw him. And in a certain sense, we have created our vision even of history. He's the Black Emperor we need, not the Black Emperor he actually was. That was never how the Romans saw him. And it just shows you how anachronistically even we view history, that if we're able to take off the goggles of the present, the filters of the present, and actually even just take ourselves out of the present, it suddenly becomes politically less controversial. We're able to talk about these ideas in ways that are 1,000 years removed. But then you come back to the present and you see what a strange world it is that we live in.
Yep.
And I think that's one of the reasons I felt compelled to write this book. It's not for everybody, but if you're a lover of history, if you're interested in potentially the parallels between Roman history and modern American history, how we got here dating back to the post-Civil War Reconstruction era where victimhood culture began, and I think how we were able to translate that into the victimhood culture that we see today, for those who actually enjoy that walk through history, that's who this book was intended for, in contrast to Woke Inc., my last book, which is more about current events and the current era. This is a walk through history that gives us, hopefully, a different view of the present.
Yeah, well, you've really targeted the wrong audience for that.
I don't know about that.
This audience, you are speaking their language. It is great. It's called A Nation of Victims, and it's written by Vivek Ramaswamy, and we appreciate everything that you do, Vivek. Thank you so much. God bless.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. Nation of Victims, must read.